Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. Today we're going to be talking about
another Stoic paradox: every foolish person is insane. So the last two episodes, we talked about some of the other Stoic paradoxes coming from this text by Marcus Tullius Cicero. And we'll give a little bit of background on that just in case you haven't been listening to all of our episodes. We're approaching 100 before too long, which we'll probably have like a big party or something like that. But back to this. So we've been looking at these, what would you call them? Counterintuitive statements.
They're ways of looking at the world that wouldn't be immediately apparent.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So the Stoics said these things, and other people were like, what the hell are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense. And then they would go on to clarify how they actually make sense. And so that's what we'll be delving into today. We'll see if it does make sense or not.
Yeah. In part, it is a pedagogical tool or like a sort of advertisement that smacks you across the face with an idea. And it's like, what are you talking about? And then you're like, okay, now I need to know what the heck you are, because otherwise you're like, you make no sense. Either you're like, you think that they're insane and you just walk away from them, or you're like, no, you have to make this make sense.
It's funny. I like that idea of advertising or marketing, because Cicero, that's his basic complaint about the Stoics is, you guys have great philosophy, you're terrible at marketing. Let me show you how it's done. You know, he was a great rhetor as well as a philosopher and statesperson. And he thought that's one place where the Aristotelians had an advantage over the Stoics, in that they really did appreciate rhetoric, not in the bad sense of like tricking people, but presenting your ideas in such a way as to like bring the audience in, to hook them in and get them interested and maybe even buying into your ideas. So this is an interesting one. Every foolish person is insane. And, you know, that's not intuitively evident, I would say, right? Kind of depends on what we mean by foolish, kind of depends on what we mean by insane. Now, I know, and I'll ask you about this, Dan, when I was younger and, you know, kind of into partying and stuff like that, we wouldn't call people fools. That would be fighting words, but we would say, oh man, you're crazy, you know, when somebody would do something stupid or, off base, we would attribute insanity to them. We didn't mean that they literally were crazy, but we threw the word around pretty.
Yeah, it might be like more logically or precise to say that is counterintuitive. Why would you make that decision? I don't understand it. When we say insane.
That's right. Yeah. I think we're attributing something stronger to somebody when we really want to say that somebody's insane or crazy or mad or any of the other synonyms. We're saying there's something wrong with their thought processes that make them unable to like fit into normal ways of doing things. Right?
To go to the party analogy, I don't know, some guy that decides they're going to do a streak around the house or something. Man, that guy was insane, but like it's memorable.
That's true. Yeah. And before we go any further, just a little digression. It seems like when it comes to that kind of behavior, there's a law of diminishing returns, right? Because you do something really, really outrageous and crazy, and then how are you going to top that? And pretty soon you have to get into like the whole realm of criminality and maybe going to jail or prison, or you've got to do something super dangerous to yourself. And it seems like, you know, with each generation, they want to find ways to top what the previous generation did, but I don't think there's that much that you can do. I mean, it's funny because my students who are now 2 generations removed from me, sometimes they'll look at me as like an old guy who doesn't really understand what student life is like. And me and my peers will be like, oh man, you guys don't have any idea how wild the stuff that we did was. You guys are pretty tame compared to what we're doing. But it's also understandable. They got less money. If you screw up, it's out there on the internet for people to see. There's so many things now that have been criminalized that were kind of minor stuff in our time, and it could ruin your life. So maybe it's a good thing that they're more tame than we were.
I'm quite happy that I was basically the last generation without smartphones in high school. Yeah. Like they just come out, but no one had the money to have them. Like we had like flip phones, and there might have been some grainy camera videos that's just really terrible, but you wouldn't be able to figure that out. But nowadays everything is just like, yep, it's out there.
Yeah, if somebody had footage of you, you could deny that it was you. It could be like, that doesn't look like me.
What, you mean that like beige blob over there? Yeah, sure, it's totally me, right?
Well, so back to this. So this is an interesting Stoic doctrine, and I think it raises a lot of issues for our own time, because we talk about mental illness, insanity, disorders quite differently than they did back then. And I think that there's a lot of issues here that don't just apply to the Stoics, but a number of other philosophies of life. So you could be an Aristotelian and worry about this kind of stuff. You could be an Epicurean and also be concerned about it. And so, one of them is whether there is like a dividing line between moral badness, however we want to figure that. We talk about viciousness or motivation or being a bad person, and then something else, being foolish or ignorant or actually having mental disorders. And we usually give a pass to people, don't we, when we say, well, they didn't know what they were doing, so they're not a bad person, they were just misguided. And I don't know that, I think the ancients, they tended to see it as more of like a continuum rather than like a strict dividing line, like, well, you're crazy, so you get off the hook,
Right. Well, I guess there is a crazy, but like usually, at least in our own world or our own society, like doesn't mean that you're like scot-free. It means that you're potentially put into against your will into some sort of institution that would prevent you from interacting, because they still see you as potentially a threat. And the question is, is the thing that is insanity something that's going to persist or not? So, like for example, there was there's a gentleman that had, I guess, child porn. He was like addicted to this, and they found out he had a tumor in his head.
Oh, right, yeah.
And they got rid of the tumor, and all of his desire for that went away, and they were able to get him out of prison because of that. And then several years later, the tumor arrived again, and he started back into his depravity. And then that was how they knew that he might have this tumor again, and they were able to find out exactly what happened. The question is, is every mental illness like that caused by a tumor, or are there, as the Stoics would say, that there are certain ideas that you have that are causing you to be insane?
And there could be an interaction between the two of them too, right? You could have like a chemical imbalance that leads to bipolar disorder, as we call it, or they say manic depression. And, you can be put on certain medication that evens everything out. I actually had an uncle who was severely bipolar, and, the medication was a real benefit to him, but it also, he didn't like the fact that it had side effects and kind of flattened everything out. But he was able to function and have a pretty normal life after they found what actually worked for him. And that gave him, you could say, the space to be able to then go to a therapist and work through some of the stuff that he never had the the possibility of working through,
Yeah.
So,
But then if you don't have that, then we get thrown into the criminal justice system. But they
oh
say, oh,
yeah,
you should have known better, and therefore, because you didn't, you caused a crime, you have transgressed against the state, and therefore we need to punish you. And the question is that the correct way to deal with someone that has an incorrect idea of what they should be doing or what the good is?
yeah, and our prisons here in the United States are full of, and I think this also holds for some other countries as well. They're full of people who are essentially mentally ill.
Mhm.
And I mean, they could be functioning better, but they're not going to get the kind of treatment that they actually need in the prison systems that they're in, with some rare exceptions. I mean, if
Mhm.
you're in a minimum security and you're in a fairly rich state that has a well-run Department of Corrections, I mean, how many of them are there? I don't know, maybe a couple. You could actually get some decent mental health treatment. But I mean, if you're in Alabama, that's, or anywhere in the deep South, where they love prisons, but they hate spending money on them, you're basically screwed. And even here in Wisconsin, I think we have a
Well, you got
lot of
private
people in
prisons
prison.
here.
That's true. Yeah. Those are bad news. And that we could do a whole other show on incarceration and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But
And while this topic is tangential, it is not the main idea herein.
yeah, but another one of the issues I would say, especially for the Stoics, is when we use this term foolishness, it's actually a technical term. It means one of the main ways in which people are bad. The Stoics think that we should strive to be wise or prudent, and if we're not doing that, we're kind of throwing away our opportunity as a human being. And so, if we're going to say that everybody who's foolish is insane, in a way, that means, if we think about it like the transitive property, right? So if moral badness is equivalent to foolishness, if foolishness is equivalent to insanity, well, then moral badness is equivalent to insanity. And I don't know that too many of us would want to buy that, right?
I guess. But that is exactly what they're saying here. And why is it that they're saying this?
Yeah.
Well, it's because the idea at its most basic is that we want to do what is good and
Right.
beneficial for us, but we have those people we would consider foolish have a misconception or a faulty judgment about what is good, and so they pursue those things that they think are good, which are actually in opposition to that good. And so you now have someone who wants to do good but is doing bad, and that would be a definition of insanity.
Yeah, and you can even do it on a couple different levels. I've had people who would raise a challenge. They would be like, well, what about somebody who knows that stealing their neighbor's truck is the wrong thing to do? And they're like, I'm going to do it anyway because I hate that bastard, or it's fun to do crimes or something like that. You can say, well, okay, so they on one level, they actually know that it's the wrong thing to do, but they're still mistaken because they think doing the wrong thing is somehow a good thing.
Right.
It's a good thing in this case because he's a bastard and I'm going to steal his truck, or it's fun to do crimes, I mean, maybe it is fun to do crimes. I mean, I think when I was a kid, I thought that, but I was a pretty stupid kid. And
Did
now
I watch a lot of the Dukes of Hazzard or something?
I actually did. But that probably wasn't the main motivation because I couldn't really, I mean, they were from Texas. I didn't really relate to them. I think more like the A-Team,
Oh, yeah.
But it's funny because you think about the A-Team, they were officially criminals, but they were like good guy criminals who would fight against bad guy criminals to right wrongs and stuff like that, right? So it's really, I mean, if we have things like that going on, it's really easy to start modeling ourselves after that and be like, well, maybe if I'm the right kind of criminal. Or think about that show Dexter, right? I don't know if you ever watched that.
Oh, I did.
But he had that code. He was a serial killer, which we usually think of as a terrible thing. And, we usually think serial killers are insane too on some level. But he was the good serial killer who went after other serial killers. So that makes his serial killing okay.
Right.
But it's still not okay from a Stoic perspective, even though it serves some sort of, socially useful purpose. He's still a serial killer, right?
So exactly. And if we're going to take, we're talking about Stoicism, we have the story of, I believe it's Marcus Aurelius, who was learning about tyrants and that you should, kill tyrants, and the gentleman who was
Cato, right?
Oh, sorry, you're right. It is totally Cato. I'm
yeah. He was going to kill Sulla.
Sulla was considered a tyrant. It's like, well, then give me a sword and I'll kill the tyrant.
Yeah. And then everyone else is like, shut up, kid.
Right.
Keep that under wraps. Because, Sulla would not only kill Cato,
him, but all of his family. And
yeah. And he was a tyrant. He was a terrible, terrible guy,
But I think his teacher had to make sure, check him for daggers for men on whenever they were in the.
That's right. Yeah.
So it was just that would be a similar. It's like, okay, if you think that tyrants are bad, then you should then kill the tyrant. Does that make you a good person? What is the right way to go about something like that?
I mean, that's one of those things where you could do what is objectively a right action, but you could be the wrong person to do it, or you could be doing it for the wrong motive. Let's say, think about the guy who tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan, Hinckley, I forget his first name. Apparently he was doing it to try to impress Jodie Foster. And that seems like a terrible reason to try to shoot somebody for me. Yeah. But, that's what he was into. And it was unsuccessful. She wasn't interested in him.
Right. I was wondering, who was a person that, should have been a tyrant, but or is a tyrant, or someone is tyrannical. Maybe they're not actually the head of state, and that someone potentially killed them, where the right person should have been some law enforcement or to deal with the bad actions that they were doing, but they failed.
You mean the law enforcement person?
Yeah.
So you're saying legitimate authorities failed. Yeah. That's interesting. And we're getting pretty far afield here, but here's a really interesting case from somebody who I knew. He was my uncle's dad, which I don't know, does it make him my uncle grandfather or something like that? And by marriage too. But he was a really cool guy. He was an Indiana state trooper for a number of years. And back then, when he was a trooper, it was pretty dangerous. And you didn't have a buddy who you were driving with. You were totally on your own. And backup would be, half an hour away at best. So he had a case where there was a guy, and he'd committed quite a few violent crimes, but he hadn't killed anybody up until that point. And I forget exactly what the circumstances were. I think he was going after his wife or something. And so anyway, this state trooper had the opportunity to kill him. And it would have been, one of those cases where he provoked the other guy into causing trouble, drawing on him, and then he would have shot him, right? And he knew that he could do this, and he knew he could get away with it, but he thought, this is wrong, I shouldn't do that, got to stay within the law and all that. And something in the back of his mind was telling him, this is an occasion where you should do that. And he didn't listen to that voice. And instead he let the guy go on his way and gave him, a very stiff warning about, you better, stay within the lines. And within a week, that guy went and killed his wife. And I remember he was telling me about this, and it was like 30 years later, and he was like, that's a case where I should have killed him. I should have dropped him. And he asked me, well, what do you think about that? Because he knew I was like, studying philosophy. I was a grad student at the time and teaching ethics classes. And I was like, I think you probably should have too, if you with all the circumstances, the way that you've told it to me. And I knew that this guy was not prone to embellishing or anything. He was a real straight shooter. And I could tell that, 30 years later, he was still conflicted about it, and I was like, yeah, I mean, it's a really tough situation to be placed in, but
yeah, it's one of those things where like if it was just you and him, you know what you would do. But within the greater context of how at least we try to build our justice system, where our police are not judge, jury, and executor, but that everyone ought to have a place in front of a jury of their peers to actually determine guilt or not. That is the thing. I guess this also kind of goes down to like pre-crime and what is it called, the Minority Report, as an example of like, oh, they know what's going to happen and therefore you should stop it, but it might not. And so the question is, what if the opposite happened? If he had dropped him, and then you would have never known if he would actually have acted in the way he did, but
that's
only
true.
because he let him go and upholded the ideals of the law that he did not do that. Maybe he could have made some trumped up charges about him and put him into the system for a bit. That might have given her space.
As a third option. Yeah. I don't think that was available as a possibility for him, or maybe not psychologically available. Maybe that wasn't something he would have thought of or would have felt okay with, But let's go back to this. So let's talk about the actual paradox. So Cicero starts with this ancient Greek expression, and then he gives a Latin translation of it. So the Greek runs like this: hoti pas aphron minatai, and the Latin is omnem stultum insandere. And we've got a bunch of different translations. Edmund says every fool is a madman. Rackham says every foolish man is mad. Mark Webb, who's a more recent translator, says every fool is insane. And then he's got another one which we can find in the Wikipedia article, all fools are mad. So you notice that they like insane, mad. These are all kind of synonyms for each other. And they're pretty close. But one thing that's kind of, it's a curiosity, and I don't want to make too much of this, is in the Greek and in the Latin, the foolish person, it's just an adjective to describe the person. Stultum means foolish. Same thing with aphron. But the being insane or being crazy, or however we want to translate it, it's actually a verb. It's not they are insane. It's rather they insane. They do insane things, And I don't know how to translate that effectively. So, I mean, do you have any ideas how you could get that across? You could say they do crazy things, but
yeah, they do crazy things. Like they act crazily. Is maybe a different way, but I really like this distinction specifically because we often talk about what are the good and bad things in Stoicism, and those are things that are virtuous or vicious. And for the most part, we don't call someone purely virtuous or vicious, but they have done virtuous or vicious things. We often will talk about just the actions that one does. More than trying to give a overall value on the individual. You can say that they tend to do that, but to call them virtuous or vicious is usually a very, very high standard to meet.
And it's tough to do unless you've spent a lot of time with that person, right? Because one could do actions that appear to be motivated by virtue, and then afterwards you find out they were in it for the money or for the prestige, or they wanted to look good for somebody who they were trying to impress, or they wanted to. I mean, you could do virtuous actions because you are full of remorse about the vicious actions you did in the past, and now you want to prove to yourself that you're a good person. I don't know if that makes you virtuous, right?
You're at least on the road to, because the whole you are what you repeatedly do. Hopefully, it turns into a habit, and that is technically virtue ethics, and repeatedly.
Yeah, that raises an interesting, what would you call this, scenario, conundrum? So let's say, I realize we're doing a lot of digressions here, but this is it's fun stuff. So let's say I do something terrible as a young man, and I feel really bad about it, and I get away with it. Nobody knows that I did it. Like, I got into a fight with somebody and inadvertently killed them, and then I hide the body. It's almost like a true crime show, right? So
sure,
I bet nobody ever finds it, because most murders aren't actually solved, as we know, right? The cops don't have a great record typically when it comes to that sort of thing. And now, and actually, he lives in my town, and I see his mom and dad, and I see them grieving, and I'm like, oh man, I should tell them, and I'm like, no, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to do socially beneficial things, and I'll make up for it somehow, right? So I actually I start helping out his mom and dad. I shovel their snow, I cut their grass, I console them when they're talking about their son, who they don't realize how bad a guy he was, and then I'm like a son to them, right? Now I'm acting virtuously. And at a certain what you're saying is that, at a certain point, I should cross a threshold, and the fake stuff that I'm doing, or the stuff I'm doing to try to make up for it, should eventually become my character. I should no longer be torn apart inside by remorse and repentance, and I should just start doing these things because they're the right things to do. I'm volunteering at the Lions Club, and I don't know, teaching kids how to basket weave or something, all sorts of walking people's dogs, doing all sorts of nice stuff for them, right?
You could this is like a crime, but you could also take this and throw it to someone that had to go to war, and they did things that they thought were terrible in war, and then they use that as a motivation. It becomes interesting in a weird way, because especially you're directly interacting with the parents of the people that they inadvertently killed, but they're hiding this thing.
Yeah.
So maybe the hidingness, I would say the hidingness makes it more difficult for them to
the hiding can kind of perpetuate the scenario, right? Because that's the hiding is a deception, and that's vicious.
Yeah. But if he does actually get to the point where it just becomes his character, that he does this even without thinking about that, then I would say that he's doing virtuous actions at that point in time, because it's now his character. As long as he's not, the motivation is just to repent without actually, acknowledging the fact of it.
Okay.
And so once again, he's doing virtuous actions. But I don't know when you would call someone virtuous or vicious. He's a complicated person. Most people are complicated people.
That's right.
We care about what they generally do now.
Well, let's come back to the Cicero text. Now, this one is a little bit different in that the explanation that Cicero gives, it's not much of an explanation at all.
No.
He spends most of it essentially doing a diatribe against an unnamed opponent, bad guy. We think that it's this guy, Publius Clodius Pulcher, who's usually referred to as just Clodius. He was an enemy of Cicero, got him exiled for a while, and he was one of these guys who had aristocratic connections. He actually apparently changed his name to make it sound more lower class, because he was always appealing to the plebeians, the lower classes. And
isn't this similar to Caesar?
I mean, Caesar was a different kind of
But
animal.
that he had aristocratic connections, but he was often appealing to the plebs.
Yeah, although Caesar more often appealed to a special kind of lower status person, his soldiers, right?
Mm, yeah.
He wasn't making, he got, really uh well in with his soldiers. And that's part of what allowed him to, cross the Rubicon in a famous way and go against the Senate and Pompey and all those people. In a way, but he was a better guy. Marius would be more like Clodius that way. And I guess you could say the difference is motivation, right? Marius was actually trying to make things better for the average guy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Sulla, he and Sulla clashed, and Sulla had him tortured in horrible ways. Seneca talks about that in On Anger. Whereas Clodius was just kind of a bad guy who, pretended to be a good guy. I mean, from the Stoic perspective, Caesar was a bad guy too. He was suspect for two reasons. One was he overthrew the Republic, and that's a bad thing, right? Mm-hmm. But he was also suspected of being an Epicurean at heart.
Mm.
In sort of a popular way, being a pleasure seeker, and they didn't like that. So
going back, we went way off track.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, he's like he does make a couple points that are useful. So he says that this person is not just being foolish, as they often are, and not just wicked, as they often are, so morally bad, but they're actually insane. They're out of their mind, dementum, and they commit insanity. And it's not clear whether he's contrasting these or whether he's saying, listen, you're just all of these rolled up in one. He does have a cool thing that he says about the wise person's mind being fortified by walls of the virtues. Mm-hmm. And he the ones that he talks about are magnanimity, or like high-mindedness, and endurance of fortune, which is tolerantia, and then contempt for merely human affairs. So he's not like citing all the virtues we'd normally think about. And he also's got a really interesting remark about why a wise person cannot be banished from a political community, which is that by the time that you're banishing a wise person from the community, there isn't any community left.
Right.
What do you make of that? I think it's an ingenious kind of argument because, Cicero himself, he's exiled. So he's like, you can't exile me, man. It's sort of like, or let me ask you, is it like when somebody tries to fire you and you're like, you can't fire me, man, I quit,
Maybe a little bit. Like he's making a definition of a political community that which has wise people in it, and no community of wise people would dismiss another wise person from that community. And so, by his definition, you can't discard a wise person, which he counts himself among that number, and thus he can't be banished because then, by definition, it wasn't a wise counsel.
Yeah. I mean, he says that when he had to go, the Roman political community or state was no longer a state. I mean, it's officially a state, but it's not a real state, right? I mean, if we applied that logic, would we be living in a political community at present, or not? A good question.
I think there are some people that are there, that are actually interested in trying to do what what they think is best for the populace,
the common good,
for the common people.
Yeah.
And then there's some people that are there because they want power, or they want, the kickbacks of like joining the private sector after they've been a congressperson or whatever, and like that's.
You don't even have to wait. Once you get in, all those lobbyists will give you tons and tons of money. So many people seem to be quite enriched by political office these days, you know?
Yeah. Not things I would particularly call virtuous.
No. No, and from the Stoic perspective, if the actions that you're engaging in as a political, let's say, agent or actor, somebody who actually has power, are not for the common good, but just for your group or party or class or something like that, then that would be vicious. That would be unjust, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So, I mean, we don't learn an awful lot by looking at Cicero's supposed explanation of this paradox, as we did with the other paradoxes.
No.
So, what should we make of this? I mean, we can kind of draw some stuff out about the wise person. We can say that, okay, so they participate in wisdom, which means that they have done some work with their mind, developing it properly, and they have these protective walls of the virtues. And so, we could talk about maybe not just, magnanimity and endurance, but they have real courage, they have real temperance, they have justice.
He does talk about like specifically the things that the Stoics call like the real goods,
right,
which are within ourselves, and those are things that they can never take away from the wise man. Like you can be exiled, but the exiled man hasn't lost anything.
Yeah.
And so I think that's useful information that he's trying to put forward here that is directly related to this idea that every foolish person is insane.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I like the emphasis on the political community. I don't usually think of myself primarily as a member of the political community, as a citizen. I usually think of myself in terms of my role, right? And then my relationships that I have with people. But I guess that is kind of, important, isn't it?
It is. Well, I guess, at least in our society, like if you were in Rome, you might not be able to actually have any influence over politics because you're either not a direct Roman citizen or you're not part of the.
You have no role then, right?
Yeah. Or if you're not part of either the aristocracy or the equestrians or whichever group that might have some sort of power by dint of their upbringing. You might be the smartest person around, but that doesn't mean that you're going to actually get your foot in the door.
Okay.
But at least within our society, there is a pathway for any of us to exert influence among those people.
Yeah, and I think we could say if you're part of a community that's larger than, say, like just a group of friends or a family, like, being part of a company or an educational institution, maybe that's kind of like being in a political community. You're serving some goods.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it doesn't have the same scope, right?
No. Because the question is, how wide or narrow do you define politics?
Yeah.
And, I guess as the
that's an interesting,
aspect of trying to make decisions that are, accepted by a larger group is politics, even if it's quite small.
Yeah. We could translate, and this is, again, lots of digressions this time, but when we have terms that we translate as political in Greek or Latin, we could also translate them as social, and maybe that makes it easier. Maybe it's a more elastic term. So
do you know the translation from Greek from what the quote, I think it's Aristotle, that a man is a political animal?
Yeah. It's saying that we are a zoon, which is an animal, a living thing, and politikon. But politikon doesn't just mean political in the sense that we think of it. It means living in a community. So it is translated sometimes as man is a social animal.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also one other term in there. I think it's katafusin, by nature. It's or it could just be fuse, which is this dative construction, but it means it's intrinsic to our nature, And the Stoics thought that too. They thought that we have, social impulses in ways that are different than even the other social animals. Like we're not like bees, we're not like ants. They've got pretty complex societies, but it's just kind of programming for them, right? Whereas we actually get together and we're like, you did the wrong thing, man. We're going to vote you out. Nobody votes out the ant queen.
Right. Although sometimes there are ants that will disagree and do their own thing.
Are there? You mean like worker ants that are like, screw it, man, I'm not dealing with this BS queen anymore or stuff like that?
Well, what they'll do is they'll just hang out in the hive and they'll eat their food and hang out and not do the work.
Well, yeah.
And I've heard this analogy to
they're freeloaders.
What?
They're freeloaders.
Yeah. Well, and so I've heard this analogy to, if you look at an ant hive as a large organism, not a community of organisms, then the ants that do that are similar to when we have tumors in our own bodies, because there are a number of cells that decide that they don't want to work with the rest of them, and they're going to just do their own thing and take their own resources and screw the large organism.
Yeah. And there is there's discussions of that in Marcus Aurelius and in Epictetus, and they use the word, and I don't remember what the Greek term is, but the word for tumor. They talk about like when we go against what the larger whole that we're a part of, so our community needs, we are acting like a tumor. And I think with Marcus, he actually says it in terms of like anger, getting angry with people, right? So that's actually a great segue back to insanity. Seneca says that anger is brief insanity. So what is foolishness? There's a lot of different, we could say, parts to it. We could maybe make sense of it by contrasting it to wisdom, and there's a lot of moving parts to wisdom, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, I think, for talking about all these different distinctions that the Stoics make, but it could be kind of useful to talk about a bit of them, right? What is wisdom concerned with? Well, it's not just like looking at the heavens above. It's about practical living. It's about figuring out what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what doesn't matter, the realm of the indifference, they're often called, and what's actually good, what's actually bad. And so to be foolish means to be ignorant or mistaken with respect to those things. And I think that makes sense, right? When we look at people making dumb decisions, we're like, what the hell were you thinking? And then they explain their thinking. We're like, so here's where you made a mistake. Here's where you made a mistake. This is factually incorrect, right?
Yeah. So like, the whole idea that we try to do what we think is the best. And if you are understanding what is the best, then you are now inherently pursuing something that isn't going to be the best. And so, think of like, petty criminals or whatnot, and then they get caught. But like, the short term, they're probably living a high. Especially if they're like at least semi-successful at it.
Yeah, they're usually kind of smart in certain ways, and then there's like some big things that they just didn't think about at all. Right.
Yeah. And so like, there's going to be, if you're going to, I don't know, be a shoplifter that's shoplifting expensive things, and you figured out some way to do this clandestinely, it's like, yes, you can do that for a while, but eventually there's going to be someone that's like, we got to stop whatever is happening with all of our merchandise leaving, and they're going to, bring the hammer down.
That is a really interesting consideration. It's what we call strategic thinking. And when it comes to like warfare, right? we see people saying, "Oh man, they're bringing out this weapon, and this is going to change everything." And no weapon ever changes everything, even atomic bombs, right? We find counters for those. Great example of this is people are like, complaining about the fact that the better NATO tanks in Ukraine are getting killed every once in a while, right? And they're like, these tanks are supposed to be invulnerable. And you're like, no weapon system is invulnerable. I mean, you can find countermeasures to anything. And you should think of that. If you're wise, you think ahead, right? So like, here's a great example of this. So think about market bubbles, right? People, they see things going upward and they're like, oh man, this is a sure thing. I better get in on this. And they don't think about the fact that if everybody else is thinking that way, pretty soon all of the commodity is essentially bought out. Everybody's speculated and it's going to drop in value. And if you're the guy who bought at the top at the very last time, which kind of makes sense because you're like, look, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up, it's going up. And, when is it actually going to reverse and go down? Well, you're screwed, and you should have thought, well, what if every other jackass has the same reasoning process as me, but they don't. People don't think that way. And so that's a sort of foolishness. I wouldn't say it's morally bad necessarily, although perhaps if you're screwing over your people that you're responsible for, people that are dependent upon you because you wanted to, I don't know, invest in tulip bulbs, or what would be the worst thing like that now?
The only thing that's coming to mind right now is the whole cabbage shorting, but that's not quite the same thing.
Cabbage shorting?
Yeah, some guy bought up all the cabbages in the United States, and
really,
yeah, it was 100 years ago or something. But it put a whole bunch of farmers out of business. But he basically cornered the market, and then he dumped them into, I believe, the Chicago River, and it was just full of cabbages floating.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's good if you want to fish out cabbages, because some people really like cabbage. But
the question is, how clean was the Chicago River? Well, if it's in
that's true.
River,
I mean, it's not even that clean right now, but
it's better than it was.
Going back to talking about wisdom and stuff like that. So, Cicero talks about wisdom as being oriented towards the true, and there's a lot of different areas of our life where we want to say things are either true or false, right? The search after truth is part of our nature. It's also part of wisdom. And I guess you could say when people are foolish, often they just kind of stop short. You can be smart in one way, but kind of dumb in another way because you don't think through things all the way. And we see this with people who have a lot of great technical skills, but don't really understand how to deal with people, or they don't think about the larger context. So, I think we could say that prudence or wisdom is something that we need. Now, as you mentioned earlier, the Stoics tend to be kind of pessimistic about how much it takes for us to acquire virtue. So, maybe it's not as easy to be wise. Maybe a lot of us think we're wiser than we are, and we're actually foolish, in which case, according to this paradox, we're actually kind of crazy, right? So yeah,
I was looking at it just being mistaken about what is actually going to get you the best outcomes in your life. If you are looking for something that will lead you to, eudaimonia, happiness, then if you are doing something that is actually going to lead you away from that, then you are acting in a crazy manner.
Yeah. So crazy could be Bugs Bunny cartoon banging, you got a pot in your head and you're banging it, your eyeballs are bulging out, or it could just be like you make dumb mistakes because you haven't really thought things through. Actually, I think, I don't remember who made this interesting comparison, but he talked about the difference between a summer fool and a winter fool. Have you ever run across this?
No.
So a summer fool is like the crazy person who we all know is crazy because we see him and they're like running around and they don't have any pants on and, they've painted themselves blue and, they're pulling out their hair and all that. It happens in the summertime, right? A winter fool is harder to tell because what they do is they come in and they were stuck in the snow, right? And the first thing that they do is they stamp their feet and they get the snow off their boots. And then they shake their coat and they get the snow off their coat. But of course they get snow on their boots in the process. And then they shake their hat and it gets it off the head and the hat, but it gets it on the coat and on the boots. And so what they're doing is counterproductive, and they didn't really think through what they're doing. And I mean, I've seen this sort of thing all the time. And I've certainly been a winterful at times with things, we say you get in your own way.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a range of foolishness.
The question is, does that automatically mean insanity? And how can we square that circle of because he is making the equivalence here.
Yeah. And so here's a question that I was thinking about. So I'm, diagnosed with mild depression. I have been since I was young. Actually, it's on the borderline of mild and moderate because the guy who gave me the inventory, it was a badly designed inventory. You answer all these questions, and if you got 0 to 50, mildly depressed, 50 to 100, moderately depressed, 100 to 150, severely depressed. Well, I scored a 50. So which am I? It's like Schrodinger's cat, right? Mild or moderate? And the guy who gave it to me, I mean, you could tell he was kind of a fool himself, even though he was a psychiatrist, because this really puzzled him. Which do I put you in? And I was like, I don't know, just flip a coin,
Right.
Make a decision. What do you think? You're the doctor. You tell me. And so anyway, he eventually went with mild. And so does that mean that I could never really be a good person from a Stoic perspective? Because I do have something that we can classify as a mental illness? Or what if you have ADHD? Or what if you have obsessive compulsive disorder, but it basically is of the sort where you check your locks every night, Does that mean that, well, you're never really going to measure up, Yeah. I don't think we want to say that.
No.
Right. But I do think we want to recognize that certain mental illnesses could actually make it quite difficult for you to develop wisdom or perhaps to develop courage. I mean, if you suffer from terrible anxiety, can you really develop the virtue of courage?
That is interesting. I am not equipped enough to answer that question, I don't think. But if we're going on the whole obsessive compulsive idea, there's a fiction book by author John Green, I think it's called Turtles All the Way Down, in which the main character has obsessive compulsive disorder, in part because John Green has obsessive compulsive disorder, and he needed to write down how certain intrusive thoughts make it incredibly difficult for him to do the things that he might want to do at any point in time. Like when those thoughts arise, it is nearly impossible to just shut them down, that they are insistent within one's mind. And yeah, absolutely, it could make someone unable to do the right thing when the right thing happens because their brain is so preoccupied with something that is not particularly important that it makes it difficult for them to do the things that they ought to be doing.
Yeah. And I don't know if this ever really does happen to anybody, but there was a really interesting comic that I came across in social media a while back, and it was about intrusive thoughts. And it was this woman, and she's saying, if I take this medication, will it help me not have these intrusive thoughts? And the doctor's like, yeah, it'll take care of that right away. And she's like, oh, they're giving me such a hard time. They're like telling me, don't kill these people, don't burn them, treat people like human beings. And then he like grabs the pill bottle away from her and he's like, no, you're going to have those intrusive thoughts now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so Stoicism, some things about it are very, very attractive. I like the fact that the Stoics are willing to call a spade a spade. They're willing to call out bad behavior and, bad motivations and stuff like that. I don't know. Do you, with this Stoic paradox, with some of the other ones I can say, yeah, okay, I could get behind that. Can you get behind this one that everybody who's foolish and therefore vicious is insane? Maybe not in the full sense of like they're totally off the walls crazy, but I mean, would you say that there's always some sort of mental disorder?
I want to use it in the regular parlance of insanity that we use in this modern day.
Okay.
But I guess if you define insanity as someone who does one thing expecting another outcome, and they do that repeatedly, then I can be behind this particular Stoic paradox.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and it's said in such a stark way, but maybe that's just, like you said, it's kind of advertising or marketing. It's making a very hyperbolic statement, which then we can like backpedal on a bit.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me of the definition of insanity, that is doing something over and over, expecting different outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, we see people doing that with everything from economic matters to relationships to, I don't know, even physical things. I mean, there's that old thing. The doctors, you go to the doctor and you're like, hey, it hurts when I raise my arm. And the doctor's like, well, maybe quit raising your arm then, buddy. Yeah.
A cursory search of the internet says that's often attributed to Einstein, but actually is from the novelist Rita Mae Brown.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting. I knew it wasn't by Einstein because I'd seen that it was a fake quote.
Yeah.
But
apparently in the book Sudden Death in 1983.
Okay. And then people just picked it up and ran with it. Yeah.
And there's speculation that it was paraphrasing something else still. But regardless about that, I think the Stoics have a good idea of it, and once again we have to parse it out. But I think that at this point in time we need to end our conversation and go out with the quote. And today we leave you with the words of Musonius Rufus: take the ordinary person. When asked whether they are stupid or intelligent, not one will confess to being stupid.